It's in the hallway. There's a lot of good things there. We just published the updated newsletter. Our newsletter is called The Voice. It has a lot of information in it. You can get that out on the literature table. We also have a place for you to write questions for our speaker. We have note cards and pencils, and Erin at the lit table can take those from you. We're going to have a moderated question and answer session, so you should fill that out. There's a place to make donations, which we encourage you to do, and I'll be asking for again later. And the donations will be split between our speaker and the Illinois Disciples Foundation. Just a couple upcoming events. I'm really excited. We have a lot of good things happening at the Illinois Disciples Foundation this semester. In addition to the speaker tonight, we have a Colombian human rights activist, Elder Ayer Sanchez, who's going to be speaking on October 10th at 7 p.m. in this room. He's going to talk about the impact of U.S. foreign policy in Colombia, specifically the policy of fumigation of the coca fields in southern Colombia, which have been completely ineffective at eradicating the coca crop and have harmed peasants and their animals and water sources. He's also going to talk about not only the paramilitaries who work with the Colombian, U.S.-backed Colombian military, but also what it's like to live under the guerrilla occupation as well in southern Colombia. So if you're interested in Colombian human rights issues, you should check that out. Connected with that, I have this personal desire to see justice in Colombia. So we're having another Colombian speaker that the IDF staff is working very hard to put together for our annual Peace with Justice Fall Dinner. People have been to fall dinners in the past. They usually happen in this room. And we're having Marino Cordoba, who is the president of the Association of Displaced Afro-Colombians, and he's going to be speaking. We're thinking it's a really important talk, it's a really important issue. We're going to have it in Page Hall, which is in the same building, just another part. And we encourage people to come to our annual Peace with Justice Fall Dinner. It's our one fundraiser that we have as a dinner each year. And the tickets are out there. You can buy those if you're interested. So let's see, that's enough about IDF events. Now I'm going to stop before getting into the speaker and ask Lauren to come up and give a quick announcement about an upcoming action in Chicago for Palestinian rights. I'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Lauren Ray, and I'm here with the Democratic Solidarity Committee. I just wanted to announce that this weekend in Chicago there's a national rally for the Palestinian right to return, and it's being organized by El Auda Chicago. It's a rally just calling for, like I said, Palestinian right to return, and is also calling for the end of Israel's apartheid regime and their oppression of the Palestinian people. There's flyers out on the table if you guys would like some, and that has the location and time of the rally as well as the website for the organization, which can give you more details. We're also planning on doing a caravan Friday to go to Chicago, as well as Sunday morning. So if you guys are interested or need a ride or something to get to the rally, please come find me or and I can give you information about that. Thank you.
Okay, just to let you know how things are going to work tonight, we're going to hear from our speaker, Osama Saba, for about 45 minutes. Then we're going to have a statement of support read by David Green, who is a member of Not in My Name. He's going to talk for about 10 minutes. During that time, you can fill out your question and answer cards, make a donation, things like that. And then we're going to leave the last 45 minutes for a question and answer session. So we'll have a good time period at the end for you to have questions, hopefully wrapping up by 9 o'clock. So that's kind of the overview. And just to let you know, the co-sponsors for tonight's programs are the Muslim Students Association, the Central Illinois Mosque and Islamic Center, which has programming every Friday night. I was there last Friday. It was a great talk, so be sure to attend those if you have a chance. It's located on Lincoln. AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, which meets every Sunday night at the IMC, located in downtown Urbana. They have a table out there. They're doing great work. The Channing Murray Foundation, also doing great work. Kathy Kelly is coming back to the community. I know a lot of you may have heard her speak here. She works for Voices in the Wilderness, which has been trying to end over 12 years of sanctions in Iraq, and she's going to be coming back to Channing Murray in November. It's also co-sponsored by the 85% Coalition, which is a GLBT direct action group trying to pass House Bill 101, which would add sexual orientation, very important to our human rights ordinance in Illinois. Also co-sponsored by the Unitarian Universalist Social Action Committee and the Progressive Resource Action Cooperative, which is going to have an upcoming event on Columbus Day, which is an anti-chief action. So lots of good organizations, co-sponsoring, doing lots of good things. I'm going to introduce the speaker and then let him go from here. Osama Saba, I've had the pleasure of taking him to some events this morning. He spoke on WILL Focus 580 this morning, and he was at Urbana High School this afternoon talking in classes there. I've been impressed by his ability to remain calm and talk about the atrocities that are happening with compassion and conviction. He was born in Jerusalem to Palestinian parents, and Osama lived in Ramallah on the West Bank, where his family still lives. He left to go to Egypt in 1987 for college, and after obtaining his bachelor's degree from the University of Cairo, he worked there for 2 years. He then returned to Palestine, where he worked for 2 years with the Palestinian Ministry of Health. In 1996, he came to the University of Iowa as a Fulbright scholar, and he stayed there to complete his PhD. He participated in the Iowa International Fellow Program and is a member and president of the Palestinian Student Organization on that campus. He has spoken at a number of events on and off campus, including the Christian Witness for Middle East Peace and Justice event, which was sponsored by the Middle East Forum and Friends of Seville and the Iowa chapter, which was held in Des Moines in Iowa City. So he's come to us with a lot of experience and firsthand witness of what's happening. So please welcome our speaker, Osama Saba.
Well, good evening. Thank you very much for coming out, and thank you for this event and for all the wonderful things that you do. Actually, when I first heard from Meredith about the possibility of me speaking here, she wrote something about we here at the IDF. And the first thing that struck me was the Israeli Defense Forces. And then I thought, well, you know what, wait a second. To me, they're known as the Israeli Occupation Forces, not the Israeli Defense Forces. And that gave me, sent me back to reality. But when I first came here and saw the amount of wonderful work that they do, I really realized that this name has been hijacked by the Israeli Defense Forces. And I just wanted to say that and say thank you for all the great work that you do, not just for Israel-Palestine, but for the rest of the world. Colombia work, local injustice here with racism and all that stuff. So back to the main issue that I'm supposed to be speaking about here tonight, which is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. First of all, I'm going to try and just give a very brief overview of the history and then speak a little bit more about my experience and living under occupation and what it meant to me, and just tell you some stories from my own perspective and my own experience. Also, I would like afterwards to give you some ideas of action that you can take to help establish a peaceful and lasting and just agreement in the Middle East. And finally, I'll be answering questions after David's talk. Just briefly and quickly to say, why is it that Palestinians and Israelis can't live together? This is a question that comes up all the time, and people say, why can't you guys live together? What's wrong with you? And just to say there's nothing wrong with us. We're like every other human being on earth. We have our rights, we have our aspirations. And for me as a Palestinian, the way I see history is that there has been a huge injustice committed against the Palestinian people, and it needs to be resolved in a way that would also maintain humanity in that solution. You cannot solve a problem at the expense of another people. And in fact, this is what happened to us. Earlier last century, in the 1800s, the Zionist movement was established, and with the goal of creating a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. And it was mobilized by the fact that the Jews were persecuted in Europe, and pogroms were taking place in Russia and other places, and they needed to have a place for them to live and be safe. And so far, so good. Nobody argues with that. They have the full right to do that. But when this becomes at my expense, at the expense of my people being disposed because of that, then that becomes my problem. And that is probably one of the major roots of the problem that we have in the Middle East right now. Jews have always lived in Palestine as members of the community there, as Palestinians. And until today, there are groups among the Jewish communities that consider themselves Palestinian more than anything else. And in fact, one of those groups is represented in the Palestinian government and have a representative for them for the Jewish affairs. And the name of this group is the Neturei Card. So this group exists, and it's outspoken, but their numbers are not that huge. They get overshadowed by other media news and by other news in the media, and they don't get enough coverage. However, things have changed, and I will talk about that later in the talk. But things escalated, and the Zionist movement pushed or convinced more Jews to emigrate to Palestine and to live there. And the Palestinians were okay with that up to a point when it was apparent that this had been done in a way to replace the people and take over the land. And that's when it was very evident that when Lord Balfour of Britain gave his infamous promise, and he said that the government of His Majesty the King views and I favor the establishment of a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. That started the internationalization of this problem and started the effect of different countries on the problem. Nobody argues that Jews lived there for the longest time. They did. And they still were there at that time. There were not as many of them as after the Zionist movement started the immigration process. But it kept escalating until in 1936, the Palestinians declared general strike in rejection of the Balfour Declaration, the British occupation, and the immigration that was intensifying in numbers. After that, the Second World War was starting, and the atrocities that Hitler committed against the Jews in Europe started taking shape, and the result of that was an even further escalation of the immigration, increase in numbers, and the mobilization of the world community to solve that problem in Europe. But unfortunately, the way they solved it was to create another problem in the Middle East. And that, started the whole thing from early 1800s and onward. After the establishment of the State of Israel, after Britain pulled out and ended its occupation of the land, the United Nations issued in 1947 the Partition Resolution, which basically gave 56% of the land to 20% of the population, which were the Jewish constituents in the community, and gave 45% to the Palestinians, the people who lived on that land, and comprised 80% of the population. So from there, people felt that there was this injustice to give, people who just immigrated to this land more land than what the people who already lived there and owned. This, of course, caused a lot of animosity, a lot of hatred, and fighting broke out. The new immigrants, the Zionists who came to Palestine, started attacking Arab villages, Palestinian villages surrounding that area, and started occupying more land. And the war in 1948 started after the British pulled out, and the Arabs decided, okay, we're going to go and fight, protect the rest of the land, and go back to the limits that the United Nations Resolution of 1947, the Partition Resolution, gave us. We won't go any further. What happened is that the Arab armies, I guess, lost in the war. Israel went on and occupied up to 78% of Palestine. And actually, I have several quotes that basically, in essence, what they say is that the Israelis were not willing to accept the United Nations partition. However, since the Arabs rejected it, it just made sense for them to accept it the way it is, and then they didn't have to stick with it. And actually, this quote I'm going to read, from what's his name? David Ben-Gurion. Actually, that was a little earlier than the partition rule, but it was a few years after the Balfour Declaration. And what it says, quote, "The acceptance of partition does not commit us to renounce Transjordan." Transjordan is across the Jordan River, Jordan and Palestine. "One does not demand from anybody to give up his vision. We shall accept a state in the boundaries fixed today, but the boundaries of Zionist aspirations are the concern of the Jewish people, and no external factor will be able to limit them. That was David Ben-Gurion in 1936, and he's quoted in Noam Chomsky's The Fateful Triangle. So that will give you an indication of why Arabs and Palestinians didn't want a Jewish state there. Also, the partition resolution that was passed in 1947 did not pass for the first time because it didn't have enough support around the world. The only countries that supported that resolution were the United States, Europe, and Australia. Those were the only countries that supported that resolution, but they did not have majority in the United Nations to pass such a resolution. However, they went on, and with the second reading, they convinced Liberia, which is an African country, that finally decided the vote and tipped the scale, and the vote passed. So the injustice comes from the fact that, you know, it wasn't something that the people of the area wanted. It was something imposed on them. We didn't have any problems with Jews living there, but we had a problem when it came at our expense and on our land. The war in 1948 created the refugee problem and disposed more than 750,000 people, Palestinians. You know, it started by creating one of the biggest refugee problems in the world, which until today, I think is one of the only refugee problems that has a complete department in the United Nations that's responsible for. And every single problem of refugees around the world talks about their right to return, and we need to work on making them return home. So why is it that the Palestinian cause has different treatment? Anyway, things carry on. Israel participates in different wars against the Arab countries in '56, joins Britain and France to attack Egypt, and more atrocities, more villages are destroyed. In 1948 itself, more than 500 Palestinian villages were razed. Those 750,000 Palestinians who were kicked out came from those villages. Those villages were razed, disappeared, do not exist on the face of the earth anymore. People realized that Israel is there to stay. So there were very, few dissenting voices, I guess, at that time, but of course they didn't make any sense because a lot of people were still hurt and they thought, this is our land, it was taken away from us, we need it back. Kept going on until Israel attacked in 1967 and occupied, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. After that, they started one of the most reprehensible policies ever, which is the settlement policies. I hate to use the word settlements because settlements does not give the right indication of what these are. These are colonies, they're not settlements, they're against international law. International law states clearly that you are not to transfer your population into newly occupied territories and disposing the people who live there. So by far, every single nation on earth, even including the US government, is against the settlement policy. But that policy started in 1967 and kept going on full force, and it was worse times for it during the peace accords in the 90s. That's when the settlement population in the West Bank, doubled from 100,000, 110,000 to 220,000 settlers living on Palestinian land that's confiscated from Palestinians. And a network of bypass roads was built on that land that basically destroyed your agricultural land. If you had a land of several acres, they would take this huge road, and it's only for Israeli settlers. You're not supposed to use it as a Palestinian. If you get caught, you might be shot, you might be put in jail. Those roads were created as an everlasting evidence that Israel is not willing to leave. So the history is full of wars. I can tell you a little bit more about the war in the 70s, and then Lebanon in '82 and all that, and everything kept going on and on from worse to worse, from worse to worse, until we got to the First Intifada. After the First Intifada, people realized that the Palestinians are not going to give up that easily. They had their aspirations, they had their hope for independence, they had their hope to be free. Like everybody on earth, they have the right, we have the right to live freely on our land. This land that we lived on for thousands of years. So after the Intifada and after this civil disobedience form of resistance, we lost, and this is a number that I got from Timothy Shorn, who is a professor of political science at the University of South Dakota. He went there and interviewed a number of people on the Palestinian and the Israeli side, people on the street, and came up with the estimate that says the number or the percentage of Palestinians killed during the first Intifada is twice that percentage of Americans killed in the Vietnam War. And that was during our civil disobedience, peaceful resistance including, rocks and, very simple things like slingshots and things like that. So people, truly hoped for peace after the first Intifada, and knowing that the world became governed by one superpower after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was definitely the U.S. way to do this. So the U.S. got the peace deal brokered, and everybody was so happy. I was one of the people who were, the happiest. I remember the day when the Palestinian Authority came into Nablus, which is the city I used to work at. I went up on a pole that was like probably 20 feet above the street to put up a Palestinian flag. We had so much hope for a peaceful life there that it all shattered after what Israel has done during those 8 years of peace, or so-called peace. I blame the Palestinian Authority for handling the peace process the way they did, and I blame Israel for what they didn't apply, what they didn't stick with. They never released the prisoners. They never relinquished land. Whatever they gave us was with a lot of strings attached. And every time they go back in their opinion, in their mind, and say, okay, we're not going to do this anymore, and the Americans would say, okay, well, let's go and sit together and talk about it a little more. And they would sign one agreement after another understanding and another, treaty, and I don't know what you call them, all these different legal terms for them, which meant nothing to us. We were hoping for peace. We were hoping to live a life, normal life, like everybody else. Our normal life, which we used to call normal when things were quiet, was not normal at all. And I'll give you a lot of examples, and I want you to be the judge and tell me if that was normal or not. But anyway, the peace process continues. Settlements increased twice as they were before the peace process, and the highest rate of increase was during the Labor government, which everybody says, oh, the Labor government is the best government that we could ever have. And I say, not really. They're both two faces of the same coin. Their goals are different. Their goals are the same, but their implementation is different. For example, the Likud government is not pro-peace, period. They don't want to talk about peace. They don't have a policy about peace. And just recently, the Likud party voted for never, ever having a Palestinian state next to the state of Israel. That's the ruling party in Israel right now, that Shimon Peres comes from. That was a vote that they took right in the middle of all the pressure that they had on from the world to leave the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank in the past few months when they reoccupied the West Bank and Gaza, or parts of Gaza. That peace process came with dividing up the Palestinian territories into somewhere between 200 to 300 different entities. Those entities are entirely separated from the next. So for example, here you're in Champaign, you cannot get to Urbana. You have to have a special permit, you have to go through multiple checkpoints, or if you want to risk it, you can go over the mountains that connect different towns, if there were any, and you could risk being shot, being killed, and being detained or arrested. So that life did not lead the Palestinians to think that Israel would ever have peace struck with the Palestinians. So we felt that there is a need for our voices to be heard. When the Camp David Accords came, we thought, you know what, everybody's crammed up with time, they need to do something. They need to get a peace deal brokered before they go out of office. Maybe there's hope. The Palestinians were a little shaky about that. They said, we don't have enough time. Things are not being studied very well. Let's just take it easy and go at it, little by little. This didn't happen. They forced, some sort of a deal on the Palestinian Authority. And personally, I think that the best thing Arafat could ever done for the peace was to reject this agreement. Because this agreement would have given us not 96% as the myth is being propagated here. It was giving us, at best, 80% of our 22%. In the late 80s and early 90s, the Palestinians have recognized the existence of Israel and the right of Israel to exist. And they agreed on all those terms, agreed to international United Nations resolutions.
And they said, Israel has the right to exist. All what we're asking for is just those 22% of the historic Palestine. And you can keep that 78%. I spoke a little bit earlier about the injustice that happened to the Palestinians and everything, and we were willing to say, okay, for sake of peace, we're willing to live alongside the state of Israel, forget about all the past, and start our lives from now as a sovereign, free country. We had so much hope for democracy that in 1996, when we had our first elections, the turnout to the elections was 80%. You don't see that in the best democratic country in the world. You don't see an 80% turnout. We had 80% turnout and 88% elected Arafat for office. And of course, they elected the PLC members, the Palestinian Legislative Council. That was a temporary thing until the final status in a few years was to come, and that was the time when we needed another set of elections, to elect our representatives for the PLC and a new government. Of course, it didn't happen for a number of reasons. First of all, the Israeli blockades and sieges of Palestinian towns did not allow that to happen. One of the stories that would show the effect of those sieges was that I live in Ramallah, which is about 12 miles away from Jerusalem. I have an aunt who lives in Jerusalem, and I just never was able to go and see her in Jerusalem. And the time I had to meet her was when I was in Jordan. I was in a training for work in Jordan, and she was visiting Jordan, and we just happened to see each other in a different country. Not that we lived 15 minutes away from each other. So that is what occupation meant to us, that you could not do anything that would, be called normal. When you go to school, as a school kid, you had to be careful not to walk, in certain areas, because the settlers might come and attack, or the soldiers might harass you, or if you walk down the street, you have to be careful that the Israeli soldiers would not stop you and ask you about your ID, and you had to show your ID, and you had to memorize the 10-digit number on your ID, and if you didn't memorize it, you're in bad trouble. Because, first of all, the first question they would ask you is, where did you get your ID from? If it's not yours, why, if you don't memorize the number, then it's not yours. Where did you steal it from, or who gave it to you? They always treated us as criminals. They always treated us as people who are willing to do anything. And that was during the best of times, when everything was so quiet, you couldn't hear anything on the news, other than the political rhetoric going on. Other than that, there was nothing. But that was our normal life. One time, I was driving back with my parents and my brother in a car from visiting family in a different town, and they stopped us at the entrance of Ramallah. And my mother speaks Hebrew. She's from the Palestinians inside Israel. And she speaks very fluently Hebrew. And the soldier asked her, where are you going? And she said, we're going home. Where were you? We said we were visiting family. And he goes, out of the blue, are you Christian or Muslim? Out of the blue. It had nothing to do with anything else. And he asked her that question. And she says, we're human beings. So he got pissed and ticked off. And he said, why are you talking to me like that? She said, you asked the wrong question. You get this answer. And he said, okay, get these guys out of the car. So he took us, myself and my brother, took us down to an area where it was probably, I would say, 3 or 4 stories deep on the side of the road. It was an industrial area where tires for cars are being disposed of. And because during the first Intifada, we used to use tires as roadblocks. So people would light up tires and use it to block off the military jeeps when they come and attack a demonstration. So they had us go down there. Of course, they got our IDs. They kept them with them because you cannot go anywhere. You cannot do anything without your ID. We had to go down and help the guys who were already there to haul up those tires to the street level, where there was another guy who had a truck who was stopped there, and he was supposed to haul these tires as far as he can, get, and dump them away from the city so that the Palestinians could not use them to block off roads and protect themselves during demonstrations. So after that, the soldiers talked to my dad and asked him to go and call on me and my brother to come up. And my dad said, "Are you crazy? Do you think I would do something like that?" And that was their policy, is to create this divide between people. So if my dad had come and called us, everybody would say, "Oh, he's working for the Israelis." And he would be branded as a collaborator, and that could get him in real trouble. So people were, aware of that, but at the same time, ignorance was there too. So the policy of the Israelis to divide and rule was always there. They've tried it in the sense that they had this village unions, if the translation is correct.
Leagues.
Leagues.
Leagues is what we use.
Okay. Village leagues, where they would elect or select few people from the villages to rule that area and provide services to the people, but those were in contact with the Israeli army, and they would feed them with information about who's doing what and who owns what and where X person lives and where Y person lives and goes to work. So they've tried that. They've tried collaborators, which we're still suffering from. It's a phenomenon that it's destroying the Palestinian community. It's creating this sense of fear among the Palestinians because you do not trust the person next to you. One time I did something stupid, which was I was applying for a permit, and my dad used to work for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency in Ramallah. So he had his special ID, and with an agreement with the United Nations, those people with those IDs, were supposedly treated a little better. So I felt like, I needed this permit because I was ready for work, and I needed it for work to go. I worked at a hospital, and I needed the permit to be able to travel to Israel to get some of the equipment fixed and get some spare parts for the equipment, because Israelis would never come to the Palestinian territories because they're afraid that there would be, rocks would be thrown at them or something like that. So I had to go to get that permit. And the minute I walked in, and I showed the ID to the soldier, I walked in, and it was easy for me, I guess. So I think that I chose the easy way. As I was walking out, a friend of mine came out of the crowd, and he ran at me. I was like, "You stupid idiot! What did you do?" I was like, "What? What's wrong?" And he said, "You didn't hear what the people next to me were saying. People next to me were saying, 'Look, there's another spy. Maybe someone would get arrested tonight.'" This is how low the level of confidence has reached between people. This is how the occupation demoralizes people and dehumanizes us and creates this community of suspicious or community that does not trust each other. And then in the end they say, "Well, you don't trust us." We had events like my mother was, during the first Intifada, was standing in an inside room, not even on a balcony or anything. It's an inside room that has a balcony attached to it. But there was an Israeli soldier on the roof of another building across the street from us. And he saw her standing there, and he shot a bullet at her, a sniper bullet basically, because it was so close to her head that she felt the heat passing by her ear. And actually what saved her, that the bullet had to go through glass at the beginning. So she heard the glass smash and jumped, and she felt the heat. And after 3-4 hours during that day, she opened the closet. She was leaning against the closet. She opens the closet, and she sees the hanging clothes has this big hole in them. And the first thing that came up to her mind was like, "We have a mouse in the house." She started screaming and ran out of the room because we had a mouse in the house. And my dad came up and looked at the closet, and they saw that the divide in the closet had a hole in it. And they opened the other side of the closet, and they could smell the burning of the clothes. And what happened is that the bullet had rested in the pile of clothes and created this hole in the pile of clothes, burning the clothes. And it was even worse when we looked at the bullet. It was one of those internationally banned bullets, the dum-dum bullet, which is an exploding bullet. It's basically a small bomb that's shot from a rifle that once it settles in its target, it explodes. It gets even worse. My mom, of course, is devastated, and she can't go in that room for a few days after that. But during that day, she went down on the street and spoke to the media. And I think it was a German TV that she found on the street, and she told them, "Look, this is what happened." And the soldiers, of course, came over, and she was speaking to the soldiers in Hebrew, and they said, "How did you know that this is a dum-dum bullet?" are you someone who deals with weapons? And they wanted to arrest her because she knew about that bullet. And her answer was, no, it's just your occupation, your TV, talking about all these bullets. Let me know about this. And of course, she got away with it, but not after being harassed and bothered. Especially also that my mother worked for the DOT, and during the first Intifada, there was a civil disobedience movement to boycott every Israeli service and product that we can live without. And everybody decided to not pay taxes, not get their licenses renewed, not get their cars registered and everything. And the DOT resigned altogether because it was run by this civil administration officer, which is a general in the army or some higher rank in the army. So they had another form of the village league, was the civil administration, which was run by basically army generals and soldiers. So all that created this feeling of distrust and fear and hate to the Israeli army and Israeli occupation. And after the Camp David Accords, people started saying, you know what, enough is enough. We can't handle it anymore. Sharon went and visited the Aqsa Mosque or the Temple Mount area, not as a sign of, a religious site, and I'm going to visit that religious site. No, he went there as a provocation. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was not the actual reason why the Intifada began. The Intifada began because people had enough. They didn't want to live with peace and occupation at the same time, because it does not make sense. There was no justice. Your land is being confiscated more than ever under the pretense of peace, under the pretense of creating this apartheid system that creates roads that are only for Israelis, not for the Palestinians. During that time, we had a lot of Palestinian groups that started and was working for internal reforms and stuff like that and call for peace. But they were faced with a lot of troubles because they could not move from one place to the other. They had to get permits. And since their goal is for the betterment of the Palestinian community, they would have more difficult, more hard time getting permits than anyone else. Even, myself, I got my visa to come here to the U.S., I've got my ticket, I've got my university acceptance, and I got my paperwork that came from the U.S. government, basically. The Fulbright Scholarship is sponsored by the U.S. government. And I had all that paperwork, and I applied for a permit just to go to the airport. I don't want to stay, in Israel. I don't want to do anything. I just want to go to the airport to fly out. And my permit was rejected the first time, for no apparent reason. But I had to apply again, fill out the paperwork, pay the fees again. That is another major source of income for the Israeli government, is the fees that we have to pay every time we have to do something, with our paperwork. So I applied again, and they gave me 4 hours to leave, And those 4 hours are usually what is required of Palestinians to be in the airport in advance. 4 hours in advance, so that they would search every single piece of garment or clothing or any article that you have with you. Basically, they take your t-shirt. Of course, they take us out, to a special room, and they take your t-shirts, for example, and they go over them by their hands. And after that, they use metal detectors to make sure that there's nothing hidden in that t-shirt. And if anybody can hide something in a t-shirt that requires this amount of search, please tell me, because, I couldn't. I thought about it so hard that I just thought, what are they looking for? Or is it just a way of intimidating people and making people feel more frustrated and, just making people more radical? That's what they wanted, radical in the sense that, people become more galvanized, more violent. And this is basically what this Israeli government wants. They are not trying to let peace and peace groups work. And there are a lot of peace groups that are on both sides, the Israeli and the Palestinian side, who are doing a lot of great work. And the few things that I want to tell you about, there are a bunch of activities going on that need your support. And one of those groups basically is Gush Shalom. I just can't say enough about Gush Shalom and say how great the work they do is. Gush Shalom is an Israeli peace bloc. They're working in Israel and abroad through other organizations. And they collaborate with both Palestinian and Israeli groups, and their goal is a two-state solution. Now, when we talk about solution, primarily there are two kinds of solutions. Well, there are several solutions, but the main two solutions that are thrown out there are the two-state solution and the one-state solution. I'm not in any position to suggest any solution being better than the other, although I have my preference. And as a Palestinian who suffered during this occupation, I think for the time being, a two-state solution would be the best. And hopefully after this period of separation where the two people decide to have their own country, build up their economy, build up their country, maybe later on we can talk about solving the issue of people having grievances because their land is still confiscated by the Israeli government. The refugees need to be dealt with. You cannot ignore the refugees. Now the refugees, their numbers grew from 750,000 in 1948 to about 4 million people around the world. You cannot just simply ignore 4 million people. They have the rights. Everybody has the right to their land. They still own the land. They still have the deeds to that land. And a lot of them have keys actually to their homes and houses still in a necklace because they're afraid that they would be chased from one country to another and they don't want to leave their keys lying somewhere. So they wear them in necklaces around their necks and hope that one day they will go back to their land. I'm not saying this because I want to destroy Israel. No. We've recognized the right of Israel to exist. We are talking to the Israelis, and we're willing to make peace. We have the right to live freely. They have the right to live freely. They have the right to security as much as we have the right to security. Violence is not going to get us anywhere. And the U.S. is the only power that is capable of of forcing the two sides to strike a peace deal. And it's more so on the Israeli side because the Israeli side is the powerful side and it's the side that holds the keys to all the solutions. That is so because, and as former President Jimmy Carter put it in the New York Times, he wrote an article a couple months ago or a little earlier than that. He said that we have the leverage to convince Israel to do the right thing. We have the leverage to follow peace and justice, to have peace and justice in the Middle East, simply because we pay Israel $10 million a day. Israel receives about $3 billion of aid, mainly military aid, that helps Israel to establish its occupation of the Palestinian territories, frees up money to be used for settlement building, use those weapons and planes and all that against the Palestinian civilians in defiance or against or not abiding with the American laws themselves, because the Weapons Export or Arms Export Act in the United States prevent the use of the weaponry that the U.S. provides against civilians. But Israel is totally in defiance of that, and the U.S. apparently is not doing anything against it. So helping peace is helping both sides achieve the goal of peace. However, at this stage, you need to separate the two, and this can only be done by sending peacekeepers. You need to send monitors to separate the two people right now. You need to push the government here to vote for something like that in the United Nations. Even if Israel refuses that, they have no authority to refuse having international monitors on Palestinian land. You could argue it either way. Palestinians, we want international monitors to be on our land. This land is illegally occupied. Send the monitors there. It's just a cycle that keeps going on and on and on. It's tit for tat. This extremist group on this side does something that the other extremist side would say, okay, we have to retaliate. So it keeps going back and forth, and there's no end to that. Peace with justice. That's a simple message. And the things you can do to help other than supporting the work that Gush Shalom does. And specifically, they have a project right now that they're trying to carry out, which is called Help Gaza Children Go to School. And basically what this project is to buy a package of items that students can take to school with them. This package includes a pen, a pencil or pencils, colored pens, a pencil case, school bag, a pair of school uniforms, some notebooks, and a toy. And this package basically costs $15. And I have the contact information for those who are interested in doing that. Also, there are a lot of projects that are being carried out by peace groups. One of them is the Rapprochement Center in Bethlehem and Beit Sahur. And what this center is doing is a lot of work that combines international people, international peace activists with local people, Israeli and Palestinian, and try to achieve a dialogue and, sustain dialogue, basically, between the people away from the politicians. Because politicians, in general, tend to make things worse than solve the issues. And another campaign that's being called for currently, which is the right season for it, it's a campaign for olive picking. And I have the information here somewhere. I have to dig it up. But whoever is interested in doing that, it's basically a trip that you have to take to the area, to the Palestinian territories, and help the Palestinians pick their olives. The problem with this is that all the olive groves are adjacent to settlements, or settlements have been built on land that had olive groves, and the settlers come out and attack Palestinians who try to go and pick the olives. And the way this is devastating the Palestinian communities is that it would be the work that they've invested all year long, plus the income for next year. So just a couple of weeks keeping the Palestinians away from their olive trees would make that crop fall on the ground, become bad and unusable for anything, and that would destroy 2 years of their lives. Other projects, there's an organization called Sabil, which is the word in Arabic for the way. And Sabil is basically an ecumenical group. They believe in liberation theology, and they work in a nonviolent way to resist the occupation. Also, there is the UPMRS, which is the United Palestinian Medical Relief Services. And they have websites for people who are interested in that. There are other groups like the Christian Peacemaker teams who go there and nonviolently try to separate between the Palestinians and the Israelis to prevent them from attacking the civilians. And there are a lot of organizations other than that that also call for adopting a child or a family to help them stay there. Or, organizations that call for buying Palestinian products. And one of them is Other Israel. And I have a website for that organization if you want. This organization is run by Israelis and Jews. And of course, coming to this point, I have to mention all the Jewish groups that are working for peace here in the United States. And I'm sure David's going to talk about some of them, and he's a member of one of them, one of the most famous groups, Not in My Name, which are committed to a peace agreement that ends the occupation and allows the two peoples to live independent, free, sovereign on their lands. You can support the refuseniks, and I believe you had one of the refuseniks who came here to Champaign and Urbana and spoke in the community here. Support their group, because these people are people of conscience who refuse to carry out orders that are seen as war crimes and crimes against humanity. You can participate in advocacy work. You can do a lot of those things basically by just educating yourself. You just go out there. I just told you a few things. Don't believe me. Don't take it for granted. Don't read the newspapers and believe what the newspapers have to say. Just go out, look up information, and make up your minds. And I'm hopeful that once you find out the solution, you find that the right solution is a peaceful solution that includes justice for both peoples. I'd like to thank you all for this chance, and hopefully we'll have a abundant session of questions. Thank you.
what I'll do is get the list of information that you just read, and we'll put it on the IDF website, so that if people want to access that site, it's www.prairienet.idf.org. It's on a lot of our literature, but we'll have all the links so that you don't have to worry about everyone going over and asking him the questions at the same time. So if Aaron is there, yeah, he's got cards and pencils. If people haven't already written questions down, you can do that. And we have a donation jar that we're going to circulate. Again, the donations will go to support the work of the Only Disciples Foundation and help pay Osama for his trip here and the work that he does. We're going to have a short statement of support by David Green, and then we'll open up for questions. So, David.
I don't really have any planned comments other than to say, Not in My Name is a group that was started in Chicago by a couple of Jewish activists a couple of years ago after the start of the current Intifada. I'm not that fond of the name Not in My Name all that much, but that's kind of what it's got. It sounds, to me, it's a little too self-righteous sounding. I prefer a name like, This Isn't What I Signed Up For. And maybe that's a little long for a website or whatever, but and by that I kind of mean Jewish people of my age especially, and maybe and hopefully even younger, were brought up in an environment in which social justice was seen as a primary value in our culture. This was, of course, during this civil rights movement. And I came to feel, I sort of hung on to this feeling, probably much too long, well into the 1990s. And I had the same kind of optimism after the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993, that Osama did. But very similarly, I realized within 2 or 3 years, I realized that after really feeling like, well, Israel has finally come to its senses, it's finally come to realize that it really has to offer the Palestinian people a real life. Not just in a grudging way, but in a generous way. But there was nothing like that to be seen in the first 2 or 3 years after the Oslo Accords. Just as Osama described, every movement, every inch of land was quote unquote given back with arguments and technicalities and conditions, and very little progress was made in those 7 years between the signing of Oslo and the start of this current Intifada. And by around 1996, 1997, I began to realize there's something more fundamental going on here within Israeli society and within the occupation itself, which has to be dealt with at a much more radical, meaning fundamental level. And part of that fundamental problem, it has a lot to do with the way the Israeli political system works, and it has a lot to do with the role of the military in the Israeli political system and the power that the military has within Israeli society. It also has to do, of course, with the power that the settlers have in the Israeli political system and the way the voting works in relation to that. But what it has to do with us is what we can control, what we have some control over. And what we have control over is the aid that the United States gives to Israel. $3 billion a year, $1.8 billion for military aid to come back here and buy weapons to meet the vested interests that are in the weapons industry for those people who have jobs because of the occupation and because of the continuing needs of the Israeli army. And then the other $1.2 billion go to so-called economic aid, much of which goes basically to provide a kind of cushion, a kind of padding, so that Israel continue to give disproportionate amounts of per capita funding to settlers. Settlers get more government aid per capita than do Israelis living within the Green Line. So we fund this occupation, you fund this occupation with your tax dollars, you fund these murders with your tax dollars. And this is the part that we have control over, so this is the part we should do something about by letting your congresspeople know. And by educating, as Osama said, by educating yourself about when you read the mainstream media, or you encounter people who say this or that about Israel, it isn't just that these are ignorant people who don't know anything about what's going on there. It's that these are quote unquote well-educated people who have been trained by the Israeli propaganda machine to say certain things in response to certain points. And you have to really know what's going on there historically and currently to know how to counter what seems like a pretty obvious case. It's an occupation, okay? It's an occupation. It's illegal. The fundamental stand that Not in My Name takes is that we're opposed to the occupation. That's the first thing that has to go. People, there have many different choices that might be made, but the occupation has to go. We don't agree on a whole lot beyond that. We debate and decide over the one-state solution versus the two-state, over the right of return versus the right of compensation, over how these things ought to be handled. Currently, there's a debate within the group as to whether it's within the purview of our organization to oppose the upcoming war against Iraq. These are difficult things to deal with in a sort of practical political way. But the thing we do agree on is the occupation has to end, and the way you end it, given the realities of Israeli society, yes, we give as much support as we can to the radical elements within Israeli society. But the main thing we can do here is influence the U.S. government and our own elected representatives to put a stop to this. I wrote a little article that's in the current IDF newsletter that I hope you'll read, which I hope states the views about this what I'm going to say in a very concise way. This has to be an ecumenical movement. We Jews in this movement felt that it was absolutely vital to have a Jewish voice in this movement for any number of reasons. Obviously, it was just vital for us to be a part of this, because it's vital for any movement of this nature to have a Jewish presence to show that this just isn't an us versus them issue. This isn't a Christian and Muslim versus Jewish issue, or a Muslim versus Jewish issue. This is an issue of people of conscience and people who respect and understand the truth of this situation versus the people who simply exploit this situation for their own power and their own political ends. But this, beyond being a Jewish movement, obviously, I think some people would like to think that, God, if we could just get to all these other Jewish people, they're educated enough, they understand what's going on. But that's not going to happen. Jewish institutions are extremely strong, and the propaganda program is extremely thick and extremely successful. And you can only get so far with it among Jewish people who are also just basically concerned with the basic fears that people have to say something that's a little bit out of the ordinary, or to challenge authority in such an obvious way. More and more of it's happening. The movement has grown from the hundreds to the thousands, and maybe to the tens of thousands among Jewish people. Certainly, it's that many people that have serious doubts about these things. But it has to be an ecumenical movement, broadly conceived, between Christians, Jews, Muslims, and whatever other religious persuasions are interested in this problem. But it has to be a secular slash religious movement also. And it has to, and people, we've gotten beyond the point here where people who are not Jewish should be shy about criticizing Israel. Yes, the charge of anti-Semitism is always leveled at critics of Israel. People just shouldn't be scared off by that anymore. People should be clear. Yes, you should be clear that you're being critical of Israel and our policy towards Israel and not towards all Jews. And no matter how much defenders and quote-unquote supporters of Israel tell you, no matter how much they tell you that no, you're being critical of all Jews if you're critical of Israel, and almost to the point of convincing people, yeah, maybe I should be critical of all Jews. Maybe there really is something wrong with all these people. Well, no, you're being critical of Israel, not even of all Jewish Israelis. You're being critical of Israeli policies and the American policies which support them. And you have to be very clear about that and not back down to these charges. Most of what supporters of Israel say isn't to promote conversation or discourse. It's to end conversation or discourse. It's to use words as weapons, or words as bullets to kind of attack and silence people. And so it's very, very rare that you have an opportunity to confront an Israeli speaker or a speaker defending Israeli policies. They're usually tightly controlled situations in which there's very little, like Dennis Ross last spring when he spoke on campus here. But when those opportunities arise, I think it's important to take advantage of them in ways that are civil and which don't lead to hostility or anger, but which try to create some space for discourse, even in propaganda-laden situations among the quote-unquote supporters of Israel and critics of Israel. And I'll just close by saying this in terms of the whole issue of who are these quote-unquote supporters of Israel. Israel is, we're Jewish, we have our own state now, and like every other state, Jews have their privileged elites and their working classes and their Arab minorities and their gender problems versus both Arab and both Palestinian and Jewish women. So the support, and they have their settlers, those settlers who were there because they were basically bribed into going there, and there's settlers who were there because they believed they should be there. But there's classes within Israel's society, and so the supporters of Israel are defending the privileged and most radical, most sort of fundamentalist and extreme elements within Israeli society. They're not defending average Israelis. What the supporters of Israel, whether there or here in this country, are basically saying is this: that they're willing to trade a few Jewish lives for a lot of Palestinian lives. They're willing to put up with, in order to keep the occupied territories, they're willing to put up with the loss of both Jewish and Arab lives. So it's not true that they're really supporters of Israel. They're supporters of the concept of greater Israel and control over the occupied territories, the people and the resources of the occupied territories, and that's to the detriment of most Israelis, and it's certainly in terms of the risks that are being taken by Jews in this country to support these powerful forces, to be identified with these powerful and ultimately unjust forces. That is the situation in which Jews have found themselves historically previously, and it is a very risky place for Jews to be. If nothing else, Jews should not be identified with this irresponsible use of power, either by Israel or by this country. Thank you.
One more announcement. Irfan, are you here? Do you want to make the announcement? You'd be welcome to come up. Okay. Okay. Friday, September 27th at 7 p.m. at the Central Illinois Mosque and Islamic Center on Lincoln. There's going to be a talk, Iraq, Inspection or Intervention. Is there a third option? By Professor Edward Kolajay, who's the Director of Global Studies at this university. So it's an important topic. It's Friday, September 27th at 7 p.m. at the mosque. So I'm going to have Osama come up here as he's looking through his questions, and we'll take questions he'll do these for about the next 45 minutes.
Okay, first question is, how does religious intolerance, play into the occupation? Is this a political issue or a religious issue or both? First of all, I see this as a political issue, an issue for land, more so than a religious issue. It has taken religious bents from time to time, and it's being painted with a religious painting as a religious fight, but it's not a religious fight, and only the extremists who are trying to silence everybody else from talking about it as a human rights issue, as an issue that calls for the end of an oppressive occupation and end of violence. So I don't think it's a religious issue personally. I know that it has some religious aspects to it, but the fight mainly is for the land and for political reasons. Another question says, your lecture is based on peace for Palestinians. Why have you failed to mention one word about suicide bombers? And it goes on about things like that, like babies killed and stuff like that. Well, I would mention suicide bombers, and I say they're reprehensible and they're condemnable. But at the same time, I would say the Israeli army's actions are terrorist actions too, and they are condemnable and reprehensible. Also, I would mention that there are Israeli groups who planted 2 bombs in a school where one of them was detonated or blew up, and 9 Palestinian kids were injured. Another, early on, this was a week ago. Another one a few weeks ago happened. But if I want to keep going back and forth and keep mentioning suicide bombings, killed 5, Israeli incursion killed 500, you know, we're not going to get anywhere. You have to have peace, and peace starts by giving the rights to people back to the people who own those rights. And as human beings, we all have the rights to live in a safe environment. That's how you want to do it. You don't start counting bodies, because if you count bodies, you'll lose. Does international laws approve the attacks against Israel in 1948, 1967, and 1973? Well, international laws guaranteed a certain border to Israel, which was guaranteed in the 1947 partition resolution. Israel took a little more than what they were given, and that's why the Arabs attacked, and their attack was to limit their advances only to the point where the partition rule was. This didn't happen, they lost, and Israel went on and took even furthermore up until 78%. And then in 1967, it was Israel who attacked, not the Arabs. In 1973, the Arabs attacked to take back the land that was taken from them during the 67 war, and did not and managed to get some of it, not all of it. Were the Jews ethnically cleansed from Arab countries? I've read more Jews were evicted than Palestinians. Well, first of all, this is not true, and if this happened, it would have been because some of those Jews decided to send their money to Israel when Israel was established, and that was something that the Arabs did not accept. So some of them might have been expelled in that sense, but a lot of them, the majority of them, decided to go and live in Israel, and in general, they were not persecuted in the Arab world.
Can I make a comment about that?
Please, please, oh no, I'd love to.
About a year and a half ago, there was an ad in the paper making this claim. There was an ad paid for by a Jewish organization, kind of making the claim. You know, they've kind of given up the idea that, up until recently, the argument was that the Palestinians left Israel because they were told to leave, so it was kind of their fault. Well, they've had, you know, the evidence really overturns that. So the argument, the sort of backup argument was, well, that the Palestinians were expelled from Israel, but the Jews were expelled from the Arab countries. But the story of the expulsion from of the so-called Arab Jews, are usually referred to as Mizrahi, from both the North African and Middle Eastern Arab countries. It's a very, very complicated one. It took place over a period of 20 or 30 years for any number of reasons, including the fact that some of them wanted to go to Israel, and that Israel made great efforts to get them to come there. And in fact, Israel made great efforts to sow conflict between those Jews and their home societies in order to get them to leave. Now, there was persecution of Jews in those countries. It's a different story in every country, a different history in Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Algeria. There's a different story in each of those countries. But this point was simply used as a propaganda ploy by the Israel lobby to somehow, and the thing that appalled me the most about it is it was something that perverted not Arab history, but Jewish history. These were Jews they were talking about here. They were using, these Jewish people in Arab countries lost their cultures. Their cultures were basically ended in the years between 1948 and the mid-60s as they moved to Israel and basically became a working class, sort of second class, minority within Israel. But there was no respect for the truth of the history and the loss that these people had endured as they moved from Arab countries to Israel. Their plight was simply being used to score propaganda points in the struggle against Palestinian rights. So I would encourage you to read. There was a speaker here a couple years ago, Joel Baiman from Stanford. He's written a wonderful book about the Jews in Egypt. I would encourage you to start with that and read anything else. You have to start out, like anything else, you have to start out with the propaganda from what is real scholarly history, but they're both there, and once you read a little bit, you'll be able to tell which is which.
Sorry, that was great. No, not at all. Actually, it was wonderful. I learned also some of that information. Could you talk about the Palestinian infrastructure and, I'm sorry, I'm horrible in deciphering handwritings. Anybody can help?
Why don't you look on?
Okay, yeah. Okay, why didn't the Palestinians declare statehood after the 47 resolution, 48 war, when they knew the Jews had established a state? Well, first of all, at that time, when when somebody walks into your house and takes a part of your house and say, this is going to be mine, and you have to live in a small part of your house, you wouldn't just sit there and say, well, okay, thank you. So it was very normal. It's a normal human reaction to say, no, wait a second, this is my land. Those 750,000 Palestinians who were kicked out are my family members, my relatives, my friends, my neighbors. The 500 Palestinian villages that were destroyed and the massacres that occurred with that were also Palestinians and relatives of mine. So I can't just sit there and say, oh, well, okay, thank you very much. That's very generous of you. So that was one of the reasons. And, you might find another political reason, or somebody might put the reason in a more political or legal terms. But I don't think any legal term would be enough or strong enough to describe the human feeling. As a human being, your emotions are the strongest thing. And the most trustworthy and genuine thing is when you speak about things that you truly believe in and you feel strongly about. So just follow your heart, and hopefully it will lead you to the right place. There's a long question here. Could you say something about the relationship between the Muslims and Christian Palestinians? Also, how does the occupation affect the two groups? Are they any different? The reason the question is asked is because of the general understanding in the U.S. that all Palestinians are Muslims. Thank you. Well, Palestinians are both Christians and Muslims, and I'm Christian, Palestinian Christian. I grew up as Greek Orthodox, and I grew up in Ramallah. I was born in Jerusalem, and a lot of my family members live all over the place, in Gaza, in Israel proper right now. I have Palestinian relatives living in the West Bank and some in East Jerusalem. We've always lived together as, one unit with no problems whatsoever. I've always had, Muslim friends most of the time. All my friends were Muslim. My best friends were Muslim. And, we had sleepovers, we had, everything you see here, normal daily life. We didn't have any problems. The occupation intended to create divides. One of the stories that happened to me and happened over and over again to many Palestinians was that at checkpoints, you would be asked to show your ID, so you'd show your ID, and of course, Israel being the democracy it is, in our IDs, they would have your religion. So they look at your ID and they would say, oh, you're a Muslim. Get out of the car, and you have to sit on the ground by the road, whether it's raining or it's, hot, cold, it doesn't matter. You have to sit there and wait, and then they look at my ID, for example, and they say, oh, you're Christian, you just stay in the car. And the car would basically be a service cab where, it takes 7 people, so you fill up the car, each one pays the fare, and it takes you from one point to another. So basically, within one cab, you create this divide that tells the Muslims, oh, those Christians are treated better by the Israelis. That's one thing. Another thing, during this current intifada, and there has been a lot of talk about the Palestinians
leaving the Palestinian territories, the Christian Palestinians leaving because of the persecution from the Muslim Palestinians. This is so totally untrue. What happened is that more Christian Palestinians have relatives living abroad, so they tend to leave more. Plus, their numbers are less, so the percentage is the same, but if you look at pure numbers, then, you know, that amplifies the thing and it looks really bad. Plus, there have been reports that the Israeli government had asked the US government to ease the visa issuance to Christians from the Palestinian community so that they would empty the land of those Christians. And again, I repeat, as Christians, we refuse to be treated any different from our Muslim brothers, Palestinians, because the occupation does not differentiate between us. Bullets kill Christians and Muslims, and I have Christian friends who got killed during Intifada, and also Palestinian Muslims who got killed during Intifada. So this argument is just another way of dehumanizing the Palestinians and shutting up anyone who's trying to argue on the basis of human rights and legality of the occupation. The way you see the problem today, where Israel is stopping about 90% of homicide bombers, how do you see them being able to attain peace without the strict laws and without endangering their own citizens? Turn over. Oh my God, that's a paragraph. Okay, well, I guess I get the main idea, hopefully. One of the things is that once you try to punish people for the actions of a few, then you're definitely committing crimes against humanity and you're abusing the law. It's as simple as that. If you impose a curfew on a group of people because one or two people decided to do one thing that's stupid and condemnable, then you're committing crimes against humanity. This is illegal in international law, so you cannot justify sending tanks in, and that's just imposing curfew. I'm not talking about sending in tanks and F-16s to bomb their houses. That takes it to another whole level, that I don't know how to describe it. I mean, it's just imposing curfew could be, crimes against humanity and illegal. Can you imagine what could be sending tanks to shell buildings? I mean, can you imagine sitting here in the U.S., and if you were living there, sitting here in the U.S. and talking to your family, and your family telling, well, we're okay, it could get worse, but so far we're okay. And the next day you go on the internet and look up pictures and see the building that's literally across the street from where you live, scorched, burnt. It was shelled by tanks, and it was not even as wide as this building away from where we live. And you tell me this is not crimes against humanity? Suicide bombers are wrong. They have no right to do what they're doing. If you give those people hope, I bet you 99% of them would never, ever think of doing that. But once you lose hope to live, once you lose hope of life and your livelihood, then anything is possible. And those are the people that you should fear the most, the people who lose hope. One of the solutions that was proposed to the Palestinian dilemma was an alternative homeland for Palestinians. Please compare the Palestinian refusal to the Zionist refusal to a similar proposal back before the Balfour Acts. Well, would you accept if I kicked you out of your house to go and live somewhere else? Let's say Native Americans came, not me, I'm a foreigner, I'm not from here. Native Americans came up to your house, knocked on the door, not even kicked you out by force, just knocked on the door and said, get out. This used to be my house. I lived here 500 years ago, not even 2,000 years ago. Would you give them the house willingly and decide, okay, I'm going to go and live somewhere else? Would you do that? Is there anyone here who would agree to that? I don't think so. This is for David. Yes.
What does Judaism say about oppression and occupation of lands belonging to other people? Judaism say about oppression and occupation of lands belonging to other people? I don't really understand this question. I mean, first of all, as I say in the little article I wrote, and to follow up on your answer, this is not a religious conflict in the Middle East. It's labeled as such for political reasons, but it's not essentially a conflict between Muslims and Jews, or Christians and Muslims, or Christians and Jews. Is support for Israel part of Judaism? No, it historically isn't. It has become, in a de facto sense, part of being Jewish, yes. But it isn't rooted in any religious text, in any biblical text. Certainly biblical references are made to Jews living in the land of Israel, and then based upon the right of return, the notion of return to Israel. But somehow for 1900 years, this really wasn't a part of Jewish religion. It became a part of Jewish religion in a de facto sense, in a secular sense, when European nationalism in the 19th century spawned national movements and movements of different peoples for nation states. The Jews, Theodor Herzl and so forth, who founded the Zionist philosophy, were not religious Jews. They predicated their views on the right that all people, all nations have a right to a piece of land. And maybe in following up on this, I can answer the first question, if I understand it. The problem with Jewish nationalism was that it had to go to a different land that was already being lived on by somebody else in order to establish itself. There's an Israeli writer with a very nice readable book named Benjamin Halachny, who says, with most national liberation movements, you had natives kicking out colonists. With the Jewish national liberation movement, you had colonists kicking out natives. That has led to this particular problem. That the practice of the particular practice of Judaism or teachings thereof really have very little to do in terms of understanding the problem in the Middle East, although certainly among certain settlers, religious motives are there and have to be understood in a very serious way. But this is a rather recent phenomenon. And while I'm here, why don't I read this question to you? Could you talk about the Palestinian infrastructure, electricity, sewers, roads, telephone lines, hospitals? I guess they're just trying to get you to address how you live. I mean, how do people live? How do people, given all the bombing and all the destruction that goes on, how do Palestinians maintain the basics of their lives, daily lives?
Okay, good. With the peace accords, the Palestinians we inherited all the infrastructure that was there from early on before the occupation and whatever was built during the occupation, and then we built on top of that. We had a new revised telephone network. It was connected with the Israeli network at some level, but it was basically new lines laid down on the streets. We had water pipes, roads. The education system included new schools, improved on the schools that existed there. All the services, the post office services, postal services in general, everything was supported by the Palestinian Authority. Health services, hospitals, and I could talk about that, in a little bit of detail if you're willing to listen to that, because that's part of what I did. I worked for the Palestinian Ministry of Health. I worked in, as a technical person, I'm a biomedical engineer. So I worked at a hospital, and I was there when we received some of the aid that went to the Palestinian Authority as equipment. And I don't have favorable things to say about that, because the equipment that we received was, in general, obsolete equipment, had no service manuals, and the manufacturers did not have anything to do with it. After, it becomes obsolete, they don't support it except for like 5 years at most. Some of it was broken. It works half the time, or some of the functions are available and the others are not. In Gaza City, I had some friends who were working there, and for their hospital, they got some baby incubators from France, I guess. And those incubators were so obsolete and old and used to the extent that they piled them up on the seashore and burned them. With as horrible as the situation was, those were even worse. So we had a lot of aid to help build the Palestinian community. It did not go that far. They tried to do that for whatever reason. They claimed they didn't want to give money. They don't want to give that, but they gave the aid in form of equipment. It did not help. Having said that, the Palestinian Ministry of Health built the hospital system and the clinic system to a level where it was providing services to pretty much everybody. Some people in remote areas had to leave and go to hospitals and clinics in neighboring towns and villages. But in general, the services were getting better. Educational system was functioning incredibly, wonderfully, considering all the limitations that they had with the amount of money that they had. It kept going on and on and on. And one of the most beautiful pictures that I've seen today and yesterday on the internet, it was from a website for an organization that's run by Hanan Ashrawi, which I think most of the people here in the U.S. are familiar with. She was the Minister for Higher Education for a while. She's a PLC member. She was part of the Palestinian delegation to the peace accords, peace talks in Madrid and Oslo. And she has this organization that talks about democracy and dialogue within the Palestinian community. And one of the pictures that struck me was a picture of students currently, these days, where there's curfews, schools are shut down. The Israeli incursions have destroyed all these schools that they went to and destroyed the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Health records that they had, where on the street, they were sitting on the street, plastic chairs, and the teacher had a small chalkboard, holding the chalkboard up like this, and he was explaining things to them. There was another picture of kids who were sitting on the floor on plastic chairs in a room, and they were learning, they had their books open in front of them, and they were writing. So I just want to say that we are willing to educate ourselves to the extent that, our human rights guarantee. We are willing to live in a democracy if we have the chance. The destruction of the infrastructure will not destroy the Palestinian humanity, will not destroy the Palestinian people. Palestinians are there to stay. So we better start working together to build the infrastructure for both of us that would establish a peaceful coexistence. What was the level of organization of the First Intifada? What role did grassroots organization play? It was, both Intifadas were entirely grassroots movements. The Palestinian Authority at different levels, and the PLO during the First Intifada, because there was no Palestinian Authority, took control of certain things. But the decentralization has always been there, and it was more a people's response to occupation. It was not a political thing. Definitely there were political actions taken, and probably that's what led, in some sense, to a peace agreement, that there was a realization that this occupation is dehumanizing the Palestinians, and the Israeli community realized that and realized what the occupation is doing to the Palestinians, rather than just integrating them in the greater Israeli society or just making them complacent and accept the occupation as it is. So there were both political gains and also gains on the ground telling that people are not willing to accept the situation. The political gains came from the fact that politicians basically were in control of certain events and certain aspects of it. What role has the media played in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Unfortunately, the media has played a destructive role, because the media in general is taking the side of the Israeli government, basically, and presenting the Palestinians as these savage Palestinians who are just, out there to kill Jews. This is totally wrong, and this is total biased media. And if you want to get good information, go out on the internet. The internet provides you with a wealth of information that, believe me, it's going to boggle your mind. And sometimes I would suggest that you would limit your information to come from 2, 3, 4 sites at the most. You go out there, spend some time to figure out which sites you'd like to listen to, but pick the sites that will give you different ideas. And then stick with those sites and read them. I would give you some sites like the Electronic Intifada. The Electronic Intifada is basically electronicintifada.net. This is a website that just debunks media criticism and gives you information in depth. It presents articles from different papers that are pro-Palestinian, papers that are not pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli, and at the same time analyzes a lot of those articles for you. That's one of my sources of information. There are other newspapers that are pretty balanced. For example, one of them is the Independent, London Independent. This is a paper that has reporters on the ground who are reporting from incidents after talking to people rather than talking to officials. Because if you want to get the true story, talk to the people, don't talk to the officials. Because officials will give you the side of the story that serves their purposes. And you don't want to get that, because that would skew the story. And I'd say that for both Palestinians and Israeli sides. What do you think is Sharon's real goal in cornering Arafat in his office in Ramallah? Can you talk about the conversion to serve?
Talk about Peruvians to serve as such.
Peruvians. Okay. Yes. Yes. Well, Sharon's goal of cornering Arafat in his headquarters in Ramallah is just a way of doing nothing to, but just to say, oh, well, I'm here, I'm trying to do all I can, but I can't. This Palestinian authority who has nothing left for their actions or for their activities to be carried out. Their jails are bombed, their cars are destroyed, their headquarters are destroyed, their weapons are confiscated, their leaders are being arrested and assassinated. I'm not defending the Palestinian Authority in general, but when it comes to preventing suicide attacks or extremist people who are trying to disseminate information like that, you cannot do that just by talking to them simply while Israeli tanks and Israeli Apache helicopters are bombing their houses. If you want to do that, you want to have a form, or you want to be presented as an authority that is capable of carrying out the law. If you want to abide by the law, if you want people to follow the law, you have to have an enforcement force to get people to follow the law. Because if people don't think that there is a punishment, then the law is irrelevant. So destroying the Palestinian Authority is just one way of Ariel Sharon to keep this thing going on, because he knows that if peace is struck, or if people start talking about peace, he has nothing to offer. Sharon prides himself that of having opposed all peace agreements that have been struck with Israel. The Egyptian peace agreement, the Jordanian peace agreement, and the Oslo Accords. He prides himself of opposing those accords or agreements. So this is someone who has never ever proposed an agreement of any form or shape. All what he does is just go in and attack, destroy. This was his policy in Lebanon, this was his policy in the 50s when he was a general in the army, and this is still his policy right now. If he's truly against suicide bombers, why doesn't he go and attack Hamas groups, for example, or a group that claims that they claim responsibility for an attack? But you know what? He goes and attacks Arafat. Why? Just because he's there and I know where he lives. This is just a way of Sharon saying, well, you know what? I'm bankrupt. I don't know what to do. And that's how I understand his message. About the Peruvian who converted into Judaism, This is actually a policy of the Israeli government, the bringing in of Jews from all over the world. And unfortunately, the way they did it, it was to go to these people who live in the mountains, away from everywhere else, and they told them, we'll give you better conditions, we'll do this, we'll do that. Why don't you just come with us, convert to Judaism? And the conversion process, from what I heard, took like a month or something. You know, it was very quickly done. Let's get it over with. And you know, what I know is that the process of conversion to Judaism takes a year or years at least.
When you're being circumcised, you really do want it to get it.
Exactly. Well, there you go. But you know, it was just a way of tipping the balance, the demographic balance there. They wanted to bring more people in that they would vote for them. So this is a standard policy of Israel, to bring in more people from outside, and actually created a problem for them because about 40% of the Israeli community now is non-Jewish. And there was debate that for soldiers who have served in the army and who have non-Jewish parents, there was a debate recently of after the soldier finishes their service, the non-Jewish parent would be kicked out of Israel. So, you know, there are all kinds of things that the Israeli government is doing to just make sure that, you know, they have the right numbers for the elections and for changing facts on the ground. What do you think of the fact that Arafat spends millions of money on his own home while people are living without food or shelter? It's a corrupt regime. Simply. I mean, you cannot say anything else. These people use the money for their own benefits. And, you know, just an example of how the Palestinian people are not happy with that is a simple vote of no confidence against Arafat's government, because it was basically a government of his own people. People are saying enough is enough. We want democracy. We want to live in a free country that we can control our future, not have two people control our future. The reform movement in the Palestinian community is one of the strongest movements, and it's the only hope that there would be a democratic country created from scratch based on true democracy. Sometimes I hate using the word democracy because it's being used and abused to present that this side is with us. Like, for example, if you want a democratic government in a country, then undemocratically you remove the previous government and assign a new government. So a government that came to power in a non-democratic way, I don't think would ever be a democratic country. How does the U.S. support the sovereign policy of 1968 and have Israel as an ally? I don't really know much about the sovereign policy of 1968, but I think that the U.S. is using Israel as an ally for a number of reasons, and for some of the historical reasons that date back to the Cold War and the need to have presence in the Middle East, because the Soviet Union had their allies in different Arab countries. And I think it goes beyond that. It maintains the instability in the region, which helps the sales of weapons. It creates military bases for American forces in the Middle East. There is some influence here with the pro-Israeli lobby that influences the American government. So it's a complicated issue, and I hope what I've been saying now relates to what your question is, but I'm sorry, I don't know what the sovereign policy of 68 is. Do you know anything about it?
It might be some United Nations thing. I don't know.
Sorry. Palestine must be from river to sea. Nobody has the right to give 1 square foot. Anyone? Palestine is an Islamic Arab Palestinian land. Israel is an illegitimate state. Well, I mean, this is a view that's shared by some people, definitely, and I respect their views, but I also think that we live in a realistic world. There are certain things that happened in the past that, I don't agree with, and I just have a view where I need to live as a human being. I'm not willing to give up everything. I'm willing to give up some. I compromised over 78% of historic Palestine just to accept 22% and live in peace. And I don't think this is too much to ask for. It's, I think, too little to ask for. And for those people who think that the existence of Israel is illegitimate, maybe it was the way it was created. But right now, it's just too late to talk about those things. We need to lobby Congress to stop support for Israel government and stop giving the $3 billion per year to create the conditions for a real just peace agreement. Yes, we do. And, you know, I totally agree that you need to write your representatives, be very polite with them, because I've seen some people who write very angry letters, and I totally appreciate everybody's effort along those lines. But at the same time, we need to talk to them in a way that they would be able to listen to us. You know, it's very difficult to control your emotions when you talk about these issues. And for me, it's very difficult because what's going on right now back home is something that would make me think a million times of just forgetting about my degree here and going back home. Right now, this minute, I'm willing to, you know, just go to my car, drive all the way to the airport, drop the car off at the airport, take the first plane and go home. I'm so willing to do that. But I'm hopeful that, you know, talking to people, reasoning with people, convincing people that there's no hope other than peace and justice, because it's going to be back and forth until we annihilate each other, which is not going to happen. You know, this is ridiculous to say that you're going to annihilate each other. People are there to live. So let's just talk about peace and live in a peaceful way. And write your representatives, write to the media, present facts. Always, when you write, put facts in your letters. They need to know the facts. A lot of people are ignorant, you know, ignorant about the situation, of course. But once they know, this has been my experience, once people realize what's going on there, they become one of your strongest supporters. And people are good at heart, but they need to know the facts. In the latest illegal act, the siege of Arafat, the U.S. just ignored until someone pointed out to Bush this might get in the way of the war on Iraq. Then and only then telephone calls started flying back and forth, but still no action. No effective action. Thank you. No effective action. Just a comment. Perhaps you can read and respond. Well, definitely the Bush administration has said it a long time ago that they're not willing to interfere. They're not willing to intervene, and they're not willing to do anything for the situation. And everything they've done since then was just a temporary solution to get a policy that they're working on to pass. What they've done over and over again was whenever they're creating coalition to go and attack Afghanistan, they would get involved and say, why don't you just keep it down for a little bit until we get the people together, and then you can do whatever you want. When the Israelis reoccupied Palestinian territories in March and April this year, what happened is that Colin Powell, when they decided to interfere, Colin Powell was sent to the region. But guess what? He went to Morocco first, then Egypt, then Saudi Arabia, then Turkey, then I don't know where, and a week later, he goes to the area and talks to the Palestinians and the Israelis. And what happens? The Israelis pull back out of the towns that they were occupying and just surround the towns and keep that siege imposed. Now the siege is lifted, true, because you can go to your neighbor's house, but you cannot go to the neighboring town or the suburb of the city that you live in. So it's definitely a policy of non-involvement, claiming that or accusing Arafat of becoming irrelevant. It's just a take on the Israeli policy, following the Sharon government's recommendations, and a recipe for non-involvement. Because they know that the Palestinian people have elected Arafat as president. We do not agree with everything he does. We do not agree with everything he says. But he's our president. We have to live with that. And until we have our free elections next time, we are the ones to say who is our leader and who isn't our leader. And that's democracy, not democracy where, okay, elect your leader, but not this guy. So, you keep saying how the Palestinian people accepted the right of Israel to exist, and then why do school books have maps of all of Israel under the sign of occupied Palestine? Well, it was called Historic Palestine, it was called Mandate Palestine, and the Zionist movement, when they were talking about the establishment of the Jewish homeland, they said, we're going to Palestine. So it is Palestine. Now these books have changed, and, excuse me, again, if you want to talk about the curricula, the Israeli government, just recently, like 2 years ago, they changed the curriculum to say, well, guess what? When we came here, there were people living here. We didn't come out of the blue, to what their propaganda was, a land with no people to a people with no land. They themselves changed that just 2 years ago. So, there has been a research done by someone, I forget his name, a professor at Georgetown University. And
His name's
Brown? Brown, exactly. Yeah. And his research was about the Palestinian curriculum, to look at it. And he said, well, the Palestinian curriculum is not truly pro-peace curriculum, but it's not pro-war. It does not denounce the right of Israel to exist. It's a nationalistic curriculum. It talks about people's rights, Palestinians' rights to live freely on their land. But it does not talk about the annihilation of Israel or denounces the right of Israel to exist anymore. I mean, you can't teach one thing and have your position that's being repeated over and over again in the media totally different. And I advise people who talk about these things or who think this way to go and read the reports from independent sources. Don't stick to one side. If you go to the Israeli sources, you'll hear one message. If you go to the Palestinian sources, you hear one message. And here I'm stereotyping because there are Palestinian groups who are descending from the main Palestinian position of the government, the Palestinian government. And again, there's an Israeli groups. There are Israeli groups that are descending from the Israeli government's position. So just go out and research, educate yourself, and don't accept things for granted. Don't take things for granted and accept them at face value.
It's going to be the last question this time.
Oh,
Just let you know.
okay.
One more.
So should I choose randomly?
Random. The best one.
When you
Best one. No, they're all wonderful, but okay. Let's choose this because it's shorter. What do you think about the recent occupation in Ramallah? What is the goal? Bring peace, bring democracy? Well, I guess we've talked about this a little earlier. Again, I'll take the shorter one. Tell us how democratic is Israel? Well, that's another talk by itself. From where I stand, I think Israel is a democracy to some Jews, not even all of them.
Excuse me, I was the one who asked the question because they keep talking about Israel as a democracy. Do they have constitution? Is it
Nope.
like country where actually religion is separated from the state?
Nope.
Why do they keep calling about democracy then?
Well,
That's
this is
why
what
I-
people here can relate to.
Yeah.
When you talk about Israel being the only democracy in the Middle East, then you'd say, oh, the rest of them are savages, they have no right to live, they're not democratic. Once they become democratic, then they have the right to live. No, that's not right. Israel is not a democracy in the sense that Arabs are being treated as second-class citizens at best. Arab villages are not being appropriated money from the budget. Arab communities are not being recognized as villages so that they won't get money. Arab schools in Israel, Palestinian schools in Israel, are not given enough money to be at the same level of expertise and give the same education to Palestinian Israelis as the Israeli schools. We had 2 speakers on campus at Iowa who spoke about this. One was an Israeli woman, and the other was a Palestinian Israeli who originally came from the Negev area. And he was talking about the Bedouin communities, the Palestinian Bedouin communities in the south. And he said that there are 5 communities there, and he gave a research that they both did that shows the amount of money that's given to these communities. And these 5 communities were among a list of about 207 communities in Israel. Communities, by communities I mean cities and school districts or something like that. And these 5 centers were the total, the lowest on the list, like 207, 206, 200, all the way to 202, those 5 communities. And the one right next to them, the Israeli community, the Jewish community there, was the second on the list. And this was supposedly, like both communities are from the same area, same, representative in the government and everything. But again, the discrimination against the Arabs is, unbelievable. For example, your IDs. Again, we as Palestinians are branded whether you're a Muslim or Christian. But in Israel, your ID tells whether you're a Jew or you're an Arab. So Christian and Muslim are combined together and they become Arabs, not Palestinians. Although they are Palestinians, but they don't even recognize the existence of the word Palestinian. So they call them Arabs, and then you have the Jews on the other side. And of course that opens the door for all kinds of discrimination against you, whether it's legal or illegal or whatever.
Sounds a lot like apartheid.
It is, and it manifests itself more in in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, where there are roads only for Israeli settlers and roads for Palestinians, and you cannot get on those roads. And you live in cantons basically, up to 300 areas.
We have to conclude, sorry, because it's 9 o'clock, but thank everybody for coming.
Thank you very much.
That was interesting. Well, no, women can go in Iraq if you really want to put yourself in that level. It's about the same as an guy, and that's